Throughout this course, I have learned a great deal about what literature is and how to understand it. I'm a journalism major, and when I think about literature, I usually think about novels. I'm used to writing short articles and stories for my journalism classes, so I occasionally dread longer mediums, and therefore literature. But what I've learned throughout this class is that there's a much more fluid definition of literature than just words on a page. Poetry is literature, novels are literature. It could even be possible for film to be literature. One of the great joys I have had in this class was making the discovery of this and understanding that literature takes many forms, which was something that really surprised me. In her article, Transactional Literature Discussions, Engaging Students in the Appreciation and Understanding of Literature, Joanne Dugan says treating literature as information poses problems for students because it neglects the aesthetic elements of literature. This echoes my own discovery that literature is not just about reading and interpreting written words, it's not just information, but also is about incorporating elements of creativity and aestheticism to make or experience something of great value. In trying to define what literature is, Jonathan Culler says, trying to identify the defining features of works deemed literary leads to discussion of important characteristics of literary works, such as their fictionality, their non-instrumental use of language, their high degree of organization that extends to levels and to linguistic features usually regarded as transparent, their dependent yet transformative relation to other texts regarded as literary. But each of these qualities is likely also to be shared with works not usually regarded as literature. He goes on to say, literariness is not confined to literature, but can be studied in historical narratives, philosophical texts, and rhetorical and cultural practices of very different sorts. Culler says what makes something literature is the context in which it is read and studied. Thus, I think our poetry essays and e-poems have great literary significance. Frederick Aiken says that the film should be capable of creating for the eye a sort of visual poetry, which would be a selection of the sight of ordinary men, just as Wordsworth poetry was a selection of the speech of ordinary men. He goes on to say, the ideal film writer is therefore the man with a gift for composing vivid visual images with the minimum of dialogue or commentary. He is more likely to have been working as a painter or cameraman, or even as a certain type of poet or novelist, than as a playwright or radio script writer. Aiken talks mostly about the interpretation of film as poetry, but in our class we proved that the inverse is also true. One can interpret the themes and aestheticism of poetry as film, just as one can interpret the themes and aestheticism of film as poetry. By converting our poems to e-poems, we emphasize the fluidity of literature and demonstrate that poetry is enhanced and brought to life by visual representations. I hope this is evident in my e-poem, where I use clock images and a moving train as metaphors for the transiency of life, which the poem Cloudfishing that I used alludes to. I hope that my poetry essay can bring to life valuable literary elements of poetry as well. I think poetry is often considered literature's little brother, but poetry is a beautiful expressive form that really capitalizes on aspects of literature, such as themes, fictional representation, motifs, sometimes plot, tension, and conflict. Poetry is one of the most expressive forms of literature and should be regarded as such. My poetry essay highlights Langston Hughes' use of poetry as a means of political activism on the issue of black rights. He helped create the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural revolution that was committed to liberating African Americans. Yes, his poetry is literature. After taking this class and discovering that literature can be a term applied more broadly to organized works of language and expression, I would consider the art and jazz music of the Harlem Renaissance to be literature as well. All of these modes of expression are valuable in teaching us to think critically, evaluate the world we live in, and decide what that means. I believe that is literature, and it is powerful. Before I took this class, I thought literature was a term that only applied to novels. Now, I feel that literature is a broader category than I could have ever imagined, and a fascinating one to discover.